At 0750 on the morning of April the 6th, 1945, a radar operator aboard the destroyer USS Bennett stared at his circular SK air search scope 75 miles northwest of Okinawa. A massive cluster of contacts appeared on the screen, range 140 miles, bearing 350 degrees. The operator counted the blips: 30 contacts, 40, 60, 100. The formation kept growing. By the time he made his report to the Combat Information Center, he had counted 156 Japanese aircraft heading directly toward the American fleet at Okinawa. Bennett occupied radar Picket Station 15, the most exposed position in a ring of 16 early warning stations surrounding the island. The destroyer's mission was simple but terrifying: detect incoming raids using radar, report contacts to fighter directors, vector combat air patrol to intercept, and absorb whatever attacks made it through. Bennett and her sister destroyers on picket duty would face the enemy first, alone, miles from the protection of the main fleet. The radar operator watching those contacts multiply on his scope understood what was coming. This was Kikusui No. 1. The first of 10 massive coordinated kamikaze strikes the Japanese would launch against American forces at Okinawa between April and June 1945. 156 aircraft in this wave alone, most of them flown by pilots who had no intention of returning home. Pilots who believed their deaths would sink enough American ships to turn the tide of the war. The Japanese were wrong, not about the courage of their pilots or the desperation of their situation, but about something they couldn't see, something their commanders didn't understand. The Americans had built a defensive system so sophisticated, so thoroughly integrated, that it would destroy the vast majority of kamikaze aircraft before they came anywhere close to their targets. A system built on radar technology, proximity-fused anti-aircraft shells, coordinated fighter direction, and systematic procedures that turned individual ships into nodes in an interconnected defensive network. The Battle of Okinawa would prove that technological integration could defeat even the most fanatical individual courage. And on April the 6th, that system was about to face its greatest test. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The kamikaze tactic emerged from desperation. By October 1944, Japan had lost the Philippines campaign, lost most of its experienced carrier pilots, and faced an American advance that seemed unstoppable. Vice Admiral Takejiro Onishi, commanding the First Air Fleet, proposed a solution: deliberately crash aircraft loaded with bombs into American carriers. Conventional attacks achieved hit rates below 3%. Pilots ran out of fuel, got shot down, or missed their targets. But a pilot who aimed his entire aircraft at a ship and flew directly into it could achieve hit rates above 30%. The mathematics were brutal but logical. If Japan had limited aircraft and almost no experienced pilots remaining, why not ensure that every sortie resulted in a hit? The tactic had precedent. Individual Japanese pilots had deliberately crashed damaged aircraft into American ships when they knew they couldn't escape. But those were spontaneous decisions by dying men. What Onishi proposed was systematic. Train pilots specifically for suicide attacks. Organize entire units around the tactic. Make crashing into the enemy the primary mission, not a desperate last resort. The proposal was approved. In late October 1944, the first organized kamikaze attacks struck American carriers at the Battle of Leyte Gulf. USS St. Lo, an escort carrier, was sunk. Several other carriers were damaged. The attacks achieved a success rate that stunned both sides. American commanders had never faced an enemy who deliberately crashed into ships. Japanese commanders realized they had found a tactic that could hurt the Americans far more than conventional attacks ever had. By the time American forces prepared to invade Okinawa in March 1945, the Imperial Japanese Navy and Imperial Japanese Army had reorganized their remaining air forces around kamikaze operations. Approximately 3,700 naval aircraft and 2,500 Army aircraft were designated for special attack missions. Most of these were trainers and obsolete models unsuitable for normal combat operations. But for kamikaze attacks, an old biplane could be just as deadly as a modern fighter. All it needed was enough fuel to reach the target and enough explosives to damage a ship when it hit. The plan was called Tengo, the decisive battle for Okinawa. Japanese commanders calculated that if kamikaze attacks could sink half the American invasion fleet, the United States might negotiate a settlement rather than continue the costly advance toward Japan's home islands. The calculation assumed that American defenses would be overwhelmed by the sheer number of attacking aircraft, launch hundreds of kamikazes simultaneously, saturate American combat air patrols, get enough aircraft through to deliver catastrophic damage, force the Americans to withdraw, or at minimum delay the invasion long enough for Japan to prepare better defenses. What Japanese commanders didn't fully understand was that American defensive capabilities had evolved dramatically since 1944. The technology that made kamikazes so effective, their willingness to press attacks to the death, also made them vulnerable to a defensive system built specifically to destroy aircraft before they reached bombing range. And that system was built on radar. Radar had existed since the beginning of the war, but early systems were primitive. The SC air search radar, used at Guadalcanal in 1942, operated at 1.5-meter wavelength. It could detect large ships at 20,000 yards, but resolution was poor. Around islands, operators couldn't distinguish between ships and land masses. The radar scope showed everything as undifferentiated blips. By 1945, American radar technology had improved dramatically. The SK air search radar operated at shorter wavelengths with far better resolution. It could detect aircraft at ranges exceeding 150 miles. It could distinguish between individual aircraft and formations. It could track multiple targets simultaneously while the ship maneuvered. But radar alone didn't win battles. The Americans learned that lesson through defeat after defeat in 1942 and 1943. Having radar and using it effectively were different problems. What made the difference at Okinawa was integration. The Americans had taken radar detection, combat information centers, fighter direction procedures, proximity-fused anti-aircraft ammunition, and coordinated fleet tactics and integrated them into a defensive system where each component enhanced the others. The Japanese would launch approximately 1,900 kamikaze sorties during the Okinawa campaign. The defensive system would destroy the vast majority before they reached their targets. The foundation of that system was the radar picket line. Starting in late March of 1945, American destroyers took up positions at 16 radar picket stations surrounding Okinawa. Each station was located approximately 75 miles from the center of the American fleet anchorage. The destroyers formed a ring covering all possible approaches from Japanese airfields on Kyushu, Formosa, and the Ryukyu Islands. The concept was simple: position destroyers with powerful SK air search radars at maximum detection range. When radar detected incoming aircraft, the destroyer's Combat Information Center would report contacts to the fleet fighter director. Fighter directors aboard carriers and command ships would vector combat air patrol fighters to intercept the raids. The fighters would destroy as many kamikazes as possible before they reached the picket line. Whatever got through would face the destroyer's anti-aircraft guns, and whatever survived, that would still have to penetrate another 75 miles to reach the main fleet and the invasion beaches. The destroyers on picket duty understood they were bait. Their job was to detect raids early and vector fighters to intercept, but kamikaze pilots, desperate to hit any target, often attacked the first ships they encountered, which meant the radar picket destroyers would absorb enormous numbers of kamikaze attacks. The assignments to picket stations became known among destroyer crews as the graveyard shift. Destroyer sailors called Picket Station 1 the northernmost position directly in the path of aircraft flying from Kyushu, the hottest spot on the picket line. A destroyer per day was the unofficial casualty rate. USS Morrison, a Fletcher-class destroyer with a crew of 329 men, took up position at Picket Station 1 on April 30th, 1945. For the next 4 days, Morrison's radar operators tracked contacts continuously. Japanese aircraft probed the picket line, testing defenses, looking for weak points. Morrison's fighter direction team vectored Marine Corsair combat air patrols to intercept raids. The system worked. Most raids were broken up by fighters before reaching Morrison's position. But on the morning of May 4th, the system failed. A large group of kamikazes evaded the combat air patrol and attacked Morrison directly. 4 kamikazes struck the destroyer in less than 5 minutes. Morrison burned intensely, rolled to starboard, and sank. 152 of her crew were killed. The survivors spent hours in the water before landing craft rescued them. Morrison's loss illustrated both the effectiveness and the limitations of the radar picket system. The radar had detected the raid. The fighter direction team had vectored interceptors. But when a large group of kamikazes broke through the fighter screen and attacked a single isolated destroyer, the ship's own anti-aircraft guns couldn't stop them all. Morrison's 5-inch guns shot down several kamikazes. Her 40mm and 20mm guns hit others, but 4 got through. 4 hits were enough to sink a destroyer. The Navy recognized the problem and adapted. By mid-April, the most threatened picket stations were reinforced. Instead of 1 destroyer alone, stations received 2 destroyers, several landing craft support ships with additional anti-aircraft guns, and dedicated combat air patrols of 4 to 8 fighters orbiting overhead continuously. The reinforced picket stations created a much stronger defensive position. 2 destroyers could coordinate their fire and support each other. Landing craft, smaller and more maneuverable, added concentrated short-range firepower, and dedicated combat air patrols meant fighters were already in position when raids approached, rather than having to be vectored from distant carriers. USS Laffey, a Fletcher-class destroyer, was stationed at Picket Station 1 on April 16th, 1945. At 0830, Laffey's radar detected a large raid approaching from the north. The Combat Information Center reported contacts to the Fleet Fighter Director. Marine Corsairs from the Combat Air Patrol engaged the raid at maximum range. But this raid was enormous. 22 kamikazes penetrated the fighter screen and attacked Laffey directly. For the next 80 minutes, Laffey's crew fought off wave after wave of suicide attacks. The destroyer's 5-inch guns fired continuously. Proximity-fused shells detonated near attacking aircraft, shredding them with shrapnel before they reached the ship. 40mm and 20mm guns created walls of fire at close range. Laffey shot down 9 kamikazes. The Marine Combat Air Patrol shot down several more, but 5 kamikazes hit Laffey. 4 bombs struck the ship. Fires erupted across the superstructure. The aft gun mounts were destroyed. Casualties were heavy. 32 crew members were killed. 71 were wounded. But Laffey stayed afloat. Damage control parties contained the fires. The ship remained under power. And after the attack ended, Laffey steamed back to the Higuchi anchorage under her own power. The destroyer survived an attack that would have sunk most ships. Why? Because American damage control procedures were as systematic and well-rehearsed as American radar-directed fighter control. Damage control parties knew exactly what to do. They had trained for fires, flooding, and combat damage. They followed established procedures, and those procedures saved the ship. The contrast with Japanese damage control was stark. When USS Albacore torpedoed the carrier Taiho at the Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944, a single torpedo hit should have caused manageable damage, but a damage control officer made a fatal error. He ordered the ventilation system turned to maximum to clear aviation fuel vapors from the hangar deck. Instead of venting the vapors overboard, the ventilation system spread them throughout the ship. Hours later, a spark ignited the vapor. Taiho exploded from within and sank. 1,500 men died, one torpedo hit, and one procedural error destroyed a fleet carrier. American damage control prevented similar disasters repeatedly. The second component of the defensive system was proximity-fused anti-aircraft ammunition. Before 1943, anti-aircraft guns used time-fused shells. Gunners set a timer on each shell to detonate at a specific altitude, but time-fused shells required precise calculation of range, altitude, and target speed. If any calculation was wrong, the shell exploded harmlessly away from the target. Hit rates were abysmal. In 1942, 5-inch guns required approximately 2,000 rounds to destroy a single aircraft. Against fast-moving kamikazes closing at high speed, time-fused shells were almost useless. The rate of change in range was too rapid. By the time a shell was fired with its timer set, the target had moved and the shell exploded too far away to cause damage. The proximity fuse, developed in secret by researchers at the National Defense Research Council, solved this problem completely. The fuse contained a miniature radio transmitter and receiver. When the shell approached within 70 yards of a target, the radio signal reflected back from the target triggered detonation. The shell didn't have to hit the aircraft. It didn't require precise timing. It simply needed to pass close enough for the radio fuse to detect the target and detonate. Lethal radius of shrapnel from a proximity-fused 5-inch shell was 70 yards. Any aircraft within that sphere would be damaged or destroyed. The first proximity-fused ammunition reached the Pacific Fleet in January 1943. USS Helena used proximity-fused 5-inch shells to shoot down a Japanese dive bomber off Guadalcanal on January 5th. The bomber didn't survive long enough to deliver its attack. The combat reports from Helena's gunnery officer noted that the new fuse was dramatically more effective than time-fused ammunition. By 1943, although only about 25% of anti-aircraft ammunition issued to the fleet had proximity fuses, those shells accounted for about 50% of Japanese aircraft shot down, a 3-to-1 effectiveness advantage. By 1945, the effectiveness ratio had increased to 6-to-1. Proximity-fused ammunition was six times more effective than time-fused shells. Against kamikazes, the advantage was even more pronounced. Kamikaze aircraft flew in relatively predictable trajectories. Once a pilot committed to his attack run, he flew straight toward his target. No evasive maneuvers, no attempt to escape. The pilot's goal was to hit the ship, which meant flying a direct course. This made kamikazes easier targets for proximity-fused shells than conventional aircraft that maneuvered to evade fire. 5-inch guns with proximity-fused ammunition required approximately 300 rounds to destroy a kamikaze. Time-fused ammunition required over 1,000 rounds. The difference was decisive. At Okinawa, American ships fired proximity-fused ammunition at unprecedented rates. During Kikusui No. 1 on April the 6th, ships expended tens of thousands of rounds. The sky filled with black bursts from exploding shells. Japanese pilots flew into walls of shrapnel that tracked them through the air. Pilots who survived described seeing shells explode near their aircraft without direct hits. They didn't understand why. Japanese intelligence never figured out that American shells contained radio fuses. They assumed American gunnery had simply improved. The third component was coordinated fighter direction. This was the capability that had destroyed Japanese naval aviation at the Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944. Combat information centers aboard carriers and command ships integrated radar data from multiple ships. Fighter directors watched transparent plotting boards showing the positions of all friendly fighters and all detected enemy aircraft. They vectored fighters to intercept raids at maximum range, positioning interceptors perfectly to catch enemy formations before they reached the fleet. At the Philippine Sea, American fighters destroyed 346 Japanese aircraft in one day. Japanese pilots never understood how American fighters always appeared at perfect positions. They didn't realize that radar detection and coordinated fighter direction had eliminated the element of surprise. At Okinawa, the same system operated on a larger scale. Task Force 58, the fast carrier force, under Vice Admiral Mark Mitcher, maintained continuous combat air patrols. Dozens of fighters orbited at various altitudes and positions around the fleet. When radar picket destroyers detected incoming raids, they reported contacts to fighter directors aboard the carriers. The fighter directors calculated intercept courses and vectored the nearest combat air patrol divisions to engage. Additional fighters launched from carriers to replace those engaging raids. The system ensured that fresh fighters were always available. The British Pacific Fleet, Task Force 57, operated with similar procedures off the Sakishima Islands between Okinawa and Formosa. British carriers attacked Japanese airfields to prevent aircraft from reinforcing Okinawa. When kamikazes attacked the British fleet, radar-directed fighters intercepted them. 6 British ships were hit by kamikazes during the campaign, but British carriers featured armored flight decks. The kamikazes that hit British carriers caused relatively minor damage. British carriers resumed flight operations within hours. American carriers with wooden flight decks would have suffered catastrophic damage from the same hits. The fourth component was systematic training and doctrine. American success at Okinawa came not just from superior technology, but from superior preparation. Radar operators trained for months before deploying. They practiced identifying different types of aircraft returns. They learned to distinguish real contacts from weather interference and false echoes. Combat Information Center teams drilled until coordination became automatic. Plotters translated radar data into accurate position marks on vertical boards. Fighter direction officers calculated intercept geometry and managed multiple fighter divisions simultaneously. Damage control parties trained constantly. They practiced fighting fires, controlling flooding, and repairing combat damage under simulated combat stress. When combat came, everyone knew their role. The system functioned because hundreds of people had practiced their parts until execution was flawless. Japanese forces never achieved comparable systematic preparation. Individual Japanese pilots trained intensively in flying skills, but large-scale coordination between airfields, between formations, between attack waves never developed systematically. Each kamikaze unit operated independently. Commanders made individual decisions. When American radar-directed defenses created a unified system, Japanese forces couldn't respond effectively because they lacked the institutional structure to coordinate similar responses. On April 6, 1945, the defensive system faced its ultimate test. Kikusui No. 1 involved 355 kamikaze aircraft and 341 conventional bombers, 696 aircraft total. The largest single air attack of the Pacific War. Japanese commanders believed the sheer number of attacking aircraft would overwhelm American defenses. They were wrong. Radar picket destroyers detected the raids at maximum range. Fighter directors vectored combat air patrols to intercept. American fighters from Task Force 58 engaged the formations at 70 to 100 miles from the fleet. The initial interceptions broke up the Japanese formations. Individual aircraft scattered. Some turned back. Most pressed on toward Okinawa. They flew into concentrated anti-aircraft fire from the picket destroyers. Proximity-fused shells detonated in clusters. Aircraft exploded. Wreckage fell into the sea. The survivors continued toward the main fleet. They encountered more fighters, more anti-aircraft fire, more proximity-fused shells. By the end of April 7th, American forces had shot down approximately 350 Japanese aircraft. The exact number was difficult to determine because multiple ships and aircraft claimed the same kills, but post-war Japanese records confirmed massive losses. Of the 696 aircraft that participated in Kikusui No. 1, fewer than 50 returned to base, a 93% attrition rate. The Americans lost 3 destroyers sunk and 10 ships damaged. Significant casualties, but nowhere near the catastrophic losses the Japanese had anticipated. The pattern repeated through 9 more Kikusui attacks between April and June. Each attack involved hundreds of aircraft. Each was detected by radar at extreme range. Each was intercepted by fighters and destroyed by anti-aircraft fire before reaching the main fleet targets. Japanese losses were unsustainable. American losses, though heavy, were manageable. The mathematics were brutal. Japan couldn't replace pilots or aircraft at anything close to the rate they were being destroyed. The United States could replace damaged ships and lost aircraft within weeks. The industrial disparity was overwhelming. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The radar picket destroyers paid an enormous price. 15 destroyers were sunk during the Okinawa campaign. 63 more were damaged, many so severely they never returned to service. The destroyer crews suffered casualties proportionate to the intensity of the attacks. Sailors on picket duty went days without sleep, remaining at general quarters during continuous alerts. Lookouts strained to spot incoming aircraft. Gun crews fired thousands of rounds. Combat Information Center operators tracked hundreds of contacts. The psychological strain was immense. Destroyer sailors at Okinawa developed a dark humor about their situation. They called the picket stations the graveyard shift. They knew they were positioned as sacrificial units to protect the main fleet. They knew that every radar contact might be the raid that finally overwhelmed their defenses. But they stayed on station. They did their jobs, they followed procedures, and the system worked. USS Hugh W. Hadley, a Fletcher-class destroyer, was stationed at Picket Station 15 on May 11, 1945, along with destroyer USS Evans and 4 landing craft support ships. At 0740, radar detected a massive raid approaching from the northeast, over 100 aircraft. The Combat Information Center reported contacts. Marine Corsairs from the dedicated Combat Air Patrol engaged immediately. But this raid was enormous and coordinated. The Japanese had learned from previous failures. They launched multiple groups from different directions to divide American defenses. For the next 90 minutes, Hadley and Evans fought off wave after wave of kamikazes. The Marine Combat Air Patrol shot down dozens. Hadley's guns destroyed more, but the raid kept coming. Individual kamikazes dove from different altitudes and directions simultaneously. The destroyers couldn't engage them all. Hadley was hit by multiple bombs and kamikazes. Evans was struck repeatedly. Both destroyers were set ablaze. Both suffered catastrophic damage. Both should have sunk, but both stayed afloat long enough for their crews to be rescued. The action report from Hadley's fighter direction team noted that the destroyer's mission was accomplished. The transports at the Okinawa anchorage were saved from an attack by 156 enemy planes by the action of the picket ships. The destroyers bore the brunt of the enemy strength and absorbed what the Japanese had to throw at them. Both ships were declared total losses, but the system had worked. The raid had been detected. Fighters had been vectored. Most kamikazes had been destroyed before reaching the main fleet. The few that survived attacked the picket destroyers instead of the invasion transports. Mission accomplished. The statistical record of the Okinawa campaign reveals the effectiveness of the American defensive system. Between March and June 1945, approximately 1,900 kamikaze sorties were launched against American forces. Of these, approximately 350 hit ships, an 18% success rate. This compared to a 34% success rate during the initial kamikaze attacks at Leyte Gulf in October 1944, before the integrated defensive system was fully developed. Yes, the difference was radar detection, combined with proximity-fused ammunition and coordinated fighter direction. At Leyte Gulf, American ships relied primarily on visual detection and time-fused anti-aircraft shells. Combat air patrols were not systematically coordinated. Radar existed, but wasn't integrated into fleet-wide defensive procedures. By Okinawa, every component had been refined and integrated. The result was a defensive system that destroyed 82% of attacking kamikazes before they reached their targets. Japanese commanders recognized the failure but couldn't understand why their attacks were so ineffective. They knew American fighters were intercepting raids. They knew American anti-aircraft fire was more accurate. But they didn't grasp that the Americans had built a system where radar detection, fighter direction, proximity-fused ammunition, and damage control procedures all reinforced each other. Individual components were powerful. Integrated together, they were overwhelming. Vice Admiral Matome Ugaki, commanding 5th Air Fleet and responsible for coordinating kamikaze operations from Kyushu, wrote in his diary after the first Kikusui attacks that American defenses were far stronger than anticipated. He noted that Japanese formations were being intercepted at extreme range by fighters that seemed to know exactly where the attacks were coming from. He observed that American anti-aircraft fire was achieving hit rates that seemed impossible, but Ugaki never understood the systematic nature of American defenses. He attributed American success to superior numbers and better equipment, which was partially true, but the decisive factor was integration. The human cost was staggering on both sides. Approximately 4,900 American sailors were killed by kamikaze attacks at Okinawa. 4,800 more were wounded. The Navy suffered more casualties from kamikaze attacks at Okinawa than in any previous engagement in either the Atlantic or Pacific. These were not abstract statistics. These were sailors burned alive when aviation fuel ignited. Sailors killed by shrapnel from exploding aircraft. Sailors who drowned when their ships sank. The radar picket destroyers bore the worst losses. Crews on those ships experienced casualty rates comparable to infantry units fighting ashore. Japanese losses were even more catastrophic. The official announcement by Combined Fleet Headquarters stated that 2,409 kamikaze pilots were killed performing their duty during World War II. Most died at Okinawa. These pilots were not the experienced veterans who had attacked Pearl Harbor or fought at Midway. By 1945, Japan's experienced pilots were dead. The kamikazes were hastily trained replacements, many with fewer than 3 months of flight instruction. They could barely fly their aircraft. They had no chance of surviving combat against experienced American fighter pilots flying superior aircraft and guided by radar-directed fighter controllers. The kamikaze tactic failed, not because the pilots lacked courage, but because courage alone couldn't overcome systematic technological superiority. Japanese pilots flew bravely into defensive systems they couldn't see and couldn't counter. American radar detected them at 150 miles. American fighter directors positioned interceptors perfectly. American fighters shot them down before they reached the fleet. Those who survived the fighters flew into proximity-fused anti-aircraft fire that destroyed them before they reached bombing range. The few who survived that faced massed gunfire from multiple ships coordinating their defenses. And if they managed to hit a ship, American damage control procedures often prevented the ship from sinking. The kamikaze campaign at Okinawa demonstrated conclusively that modern warfare had entered an era where systematic integration of technology, training, and doctrine determined outcomes more than individual courage or skill. The Japanese had courage. They had dedication. They had pilots willing to die. What they lacked was a defensive system capable of competing with American radar-directed fighter control and proximity-fused anti-aircraft fire. That deficiency cost them 1,900 aircraft and achieved nothing strategically significant. After Okinawa secured in late June 1945, American planners began preparing for the invasion of Japan's home islands. Operation Downfall would have been the largest amphibious invasion in history. Planners assumed kamikaze attacks would be even more intense than at Okinawa. Japanese forces were holding thousands of aircraft in reserve, specifically for the decisive battle defending the home islands. American casualties were projected in the hundreds of thousands. The invasion never happened. On August 6, 1945, the atomic bomb destroyed Hiroshima. 3 days later, Nagasaki was destroyed. Japan surrendered on August 15th. The kamikaze threat ended not because American defenses had defeated it completely, but because the war ended before the ultimate test could occur. But the lessons learned at Okinawa shaped naval warfare for decades afterward. The integrated defensive system, built around radar detection, fighter direction, and coordinated anti-aircraft fire, became standard doctrine. When the Navy developed the Aegis combat system in the 1970s and 80s, it built on the same principles established during World War II. Detect threats at maximum range using radar. Coordinate defensive weapons through centralized direction. Engage threats systematically before they reach defended ships. The technology advanced dramatically. Computers replaced grease pencil plots. Digital displays replaced transparent boards. But the underlying concept remained identical. The men who operated the radar systems plotted contacts in combat information centers, directed fighters, and fired proximity-fused ammunition at Okinawa received little public recognition. No individual awards, no names in official histories. The radar operators who detected raids at 150 miles remained anonymous. The combat information center crews who coordinated defenses worked in darkened spaces where no photographers recorded their actions. The destroyer sailors who absorbed kamikaze attacks on the picket line died largely forgotten, except by their families and shipmates. But their contribution to victory was as significant as any combat pilot or marine assault unit. They proved that modern warfare required new types of warriors, not just brave individuals willing to face danger, but technically trained personnel who could operate complex systems under stress. The image of the warrior changed in 1945. It has continued changing ever since. Wars are now fought by people who understand technology, who can integrate multiple systems, who follow procedures, who work as teams. Individual heroism still matters, but systematic competence matters more. The Battle of Okinawa stands as final proof that courage without technology loses to technology with courage. The Japanese had courage. The Americans had both. And in modern warfare, that difference is decisive. 1,900 kamikaze sorties, 1,500 aircraft destroyed before reaching their targets. The mathematics were brutal. The lesson was clear. In an age of radar, proximity fuses, and coordinated defenses, suicide attacks couldn't succeed, no matter how brave the attackers were. The system defeated them. The system always would. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.